A foreign minister most people could not find on a map arrived in Canada. He traveled through 3 cities over 3 days. He met with top cabinet officials. He visited a facility in Toronto. He flew west to Calgary. And by the time his plane left Canadian ground, what he had quietly brought was already spreading through the Department of National Defense. The man is Žygimantas Paviljonis. He is in charge of foreign affairs for Lithuania, a Baltic nation with a population smaller than the greater Toronto area, and what he brought into those meetings was something far more valuable than a folder of trade numbers or the usual words of diplomatic messages. He came with a working plan, one Canada really needs right now. What happened this week between Ottawa and Vilnius was not normal diplomatic work. It was a quiet admission that Canada, a G7 nation with the second largest land area on the planet, has fallen behind a Baltic country of fewer than 3 million people in the area that suddenly matters more than anything else. The ability to change a peacetime economy into a strong system capable of supporting a military alliance under pressure. If you want to understand this story before it reaches the main evening news, stay with me. This is what happened, why Carney's government opened every door, and what Lithuania figured out years before Canada even started asking the right questions. Let's set the scene. It is 2026. The trade fight between Canada and the United States has entered its second year. The Carney government has been working to move Canadian industry away from the American market, while at the same time meeting NATO's long-ignored spending needs. Canada's first ever defense industrial strategy, released in February of this year, set out goals that would have seemed impossible just 3 years ago. The government wants to raise the share of defense contracts given to Canadian companies from 43% today to 70% within 10 years. It aims to increase defense exports by 50% and create 125,000 new jobs in the sector by 2035. Ottawa has promised $81.8 billion towards rebuilding and re-equipping the Canadian Armed Forces. A new defense investment agency has been created to cut through years of delays. These are real promises, backed by real money. But promises and speed are different things, and the urgency on the ground inside the alliance is speeding up faster than Canadian government timelines were built to handle. That is the Canada that Lithuania walked into this week. Now look at Lithuania from the other side of that talk. When Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, Lithuania did not wait. The country was already spending above NATO's 2% target and simply pushed harder. By 2025, defense spending had climbed to roughly 4% of gross domestic product. Then, in December of last year, the Lithuanian parliament approved the 2026 national budget and put inside it a defense amount of 5.38% of GDP, the highest in the country's post-Soviet history, amounting to approximately $4.79 billion, directed entirely at military strength. The government has promised to keep spending between 5% and 6% of GDP every year through 2030. To put that in plain terms, Lithuania is treating national defense the way wartime governments once treated steel production: non-negotiable, steady, growing. And Lithuanian industry has responded to match. Companies that previously made commercial and industrial goods changed their tools. A defense sector that barely showed up at the continental level a decade ago is now connected into NATO supply chains across the alliance. Firms that began with dual-use photonics, advanced sensors, and precision laser systems found their civilian skills turning directly into military uses, targeting systems, electro-optical platforms, drone guidance parts. The knowledge base was already there. What changed was the political will to point it at a defense problem and the government rules to make that change financially possible. Approximately 60% of Lithuanian defense firms now export their products to allied customers across the bloc and beyond. Belgium, Finland, Spain, and Australia are among the countries buying from Lithuanian suppliers. And here is the detail that should hit hard in any Canadian policy talk. The Canadian Armed Forces are already among them. The Canada-Lithuania defense relationship is not a proposal on paper. It is already working, moving through actual buying channels, largely below public notice. That existing relationship was the base beneath this week's visit. The Lithuanian side came not simply to announce a partnership, but to deepen one that is already producing results. And the message delivered in those meetings contained an offer with significant strategic weight. Lithuania, the visitors told their Canadian counterparts, can function as Canada's working gateway into European defense buying. Not a trading partner in the traditional sense, something more structural. A guide through a system Canada has just been handed access to, but has not yet learned to use. That system is called SAFE. The full name is Security Action for Europe. It is a €150 billion financing tool created by the European Union in May 2025, designed to help member states invest together in defense industrial production, close critical capability gaps, and build a continental supply base that is not dependent on any single outside power. The program provides low interest, long maturity loans to participating nations, funding the buying of priority military equipment from artillery rounds to drone systems to electronic warfare tools. Canada's position within that framework is by any measure remarkable. In December 2025, Prime Minister Carney finished negotiations making Canada the first and only non-European country granted special access to SAFE. The agreement was formally signed at the Munich Security Conference in February of this year. Canadian firms can now partner with European manufacturers to compete for contracts funded through SAFE financing. The door is legally open. What Canada still lacks is an experienced hand on the other side of that door, someone who knows which hallways lead to contracts and which lead to delays. That is precisely what Lithuania is offering to be. Vilnius has deep working relationships with European buying officers. It understands how the SAFE system turns a national defense investment plan into an actual signed contract. It has already moved through the bureaucratic structure that Canadian companies are only now beginning to study. For a Canadian industry that has spent decades selling mainly into Pentagon programs, a partner like this is worth considerably more than any government trade promotion brochure. The timing of this visit is not by accident. In January 2027, Lithuania takes the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. For 6 months, Vilnius will lead the bloc's policy agenda, set law priorities, and guide talks across every major area, including defense industrial policy. What Lithuanian officials signaled in Ottawa this week is that Canadian interests can be built into that presidency agenda now, before the chair rotates, if Ottawa moves with purpose over the coming months. This is what strategic access looks like in practice, not a press release after the fact. A working relationship built in advance of the moment when one partner holds real institutional power inside the world's largest trading bloc. For Canada, which has spent decades defining its international relationships almost only through the view of the American border, this kind of positioning represents a genuinely different way of operating in the world. Let's zoom out to geography, because the geography of this connection carries more weight than most commentary admits. Lithuania sits on NATO's eastern flank. It shares a border with Belarus and sits along the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, a narrow piece of militarized land on the Baltic coast with no land connection to Russia proper. Every square kilometer of Lithuanian land exists within range of a hostile neighbor. That reality has shaped Lithuanian policy thinking for 3.5 decades, since independence in 1990. Vilnius does not need a geopolitical wake-up call. It has been awake and has governed accordingly. Canada sits on NATO's northern flank. Different geography, same adversary. Russian military planes regularly test Arctic airspace. Russian submarines test approaches toward the Northwest Passage. Chinese research ships pass through Canadian waters with increasing regularity under commercial cover that convinces nobody in the intelligence community. The threat environment Canada is now being forced to face in 2026 is the threat environment Lithuania has been managing since the Cold War ended. That shared context is why talks between these two capitals move faster than the usual pace of diplomatic exchange. Canadian officials in those meetings this week were asking exact and practical questions. How quickly can a company that manufactures civilian industrial parts change output to military standards? What reward systems actually work when you need engineers and production managers to shift from commercial contracts to defense buying on a tight timeline? How does a small, open economy keep export strength while at the same time growing defense spending at historically unusual speed? What does a genuine wartime industrial policy look like inside a parliamentary democracy where the normal instinct is to debate before deciding? Lithuania has lived all of those questions. The answers sitting inside the Lithuanian policy experience are not theoretical case studies drawn from school research. They are working records drawn from the last 4 years of actual action under actual geopolitical pressure. The implications for Canadian policy that come from this visit are sharper and more immediate than the diplomatic language around it suggests. First, the Carney government now has a second serious European support point beyond the obvious capitals. Berlin, Paris, and London all matter to Canadian foreign policy, but none of those relationships offers what Vilnius uniquely provides: a similar size case study in mobilizing a small, open economy under conditions of genuine closeness to military threat. Second, Canadian defense companies now have a credible partner positioned inside NATO supply chains who can speak to their capability on the basis of direct experience. When Lithuanian buying officers tell alliance counterparts that a Canadian product meets operational standards, that carries a different weight than anything produced by a trade group or a government export promotion office. Third, the Canada-EU relationship gains a new structural layer. The trade side was built through CETA. Defense industrial cooperation through SAFE is now becoming a second path, and the Lithuanian gateway is arguably the most direct path to making that second path work rather than just on paper. What struck observers most about the substance of this week's talks was the tone in which the Lithuanian side delivered its offer. There was no suggestion that Canada had failed or that the journey here had been foolish. The framing was forward-looking and practical. The message, reduced to its core, was that Canada's defense shift is welcome inside the alliance, that arriving later than others is better than not arriving at all, and that Lithuania's experience is available to be shared. That is the language of a partner who needs Canada to succeed, not the language of a competitor enjoying a rival's problems. Lithuania understands something that Ottawa is now, finally, beginning to fully accept. The adversary that presses against Lithuania's eastern border does not soften its behavior based on which NATO ally is underprepared. The pressure bearing down on Vilnius today is structurally connected to the pressure on the entire northern and eastern flank of the alliance. NATO either holds together as an industrial and military reality, or it weakens at every seam at the same time. The visit ended with promises to deepen the working relationship. Canadian defense companies are expected to travel to Lithuania in the coming months. Government officials on both sides are continuing structured talks through established diplomatic channels. A relationship that was already real, if quiet, has now been given a higher political profile and a clearer institutional shape. For Canadians trying to understand why a Baltic economy smaller than metropolitan Vancouver suddenly holds a position of genuine importance in Canadian defense and foreign policy, three numbers provide the most direct answer: a defense budget of 5.38% of GDP, 60% of defense firms exporting into allied supply chains, a defense sector that has grown dramatically in a short time, under real pressure and in real time. Those are not hopeful targets Canada is chasing. Those are the current results of a country that made its decisions years ago and acted on them. That country just sat down in Ottawa and offered to share everything it learned. The framework is on the table. The partnership is taking shape. The European door, unlocked by Canada's SAFE agreement, now has a guide standing on the other side who knows the building. What comes next belongs entirely to Canadian leaders and the speed with which they choose to move. For those watching Canada's place in the world change faster than the headlines can keep pace with, this is the story that explains why a Lithuanian minister in a Canadian meeting room this week mattered more than most of the week's louder news. Stay close. The moves that define the next decade of Canadian sovereignty are happening in rooms like that one.